Rumours have been abounding all week that there could have been an election called on Thursday, Friday or Monday next week, and that this is all about heading off any kind of attempts to topple the Prime Minister following the local election results and effectively rendering those local elections almost meaningless for the party. I'm sort of slightly counterintuitive about this. Everybody is pouring huge amounts of cold water on this, but they always do. And I broke the story, I'm thinking now, it's like 7-8 years ago, that Theresa May was going to call a snap general election. And all sorts of buckets were thrown all over me multiple times by everybody from the most senior parts of the Conservative Party saying, this was madness, she wasn't going to do it, absolutely not, there was not going to be an election. And then 10 days later, they called an election. So, I mean, looking at it from a rational perspective, and to be honest, I mean, you could ask me the same question every time we meet, and I would probably tell you the same thing.
Do you know, I think I do, but yeah.
The only person that genuinely knows is about 3 people, including the Prime Minister, about what they are really thinking about. Do I think that there's been more discussion about the prospects of there being an early election? Yes. Do I think that more people are coming over to the idea that an earlier general election might be in scope? Yes. Do I think it will happen? Not really.
Up to the minute analysis from the Sunday Times' political editor, Caroline Wheeler. Hello, Caroline.
Good morning.
Good morning. OK, so big story this week, north of the border. Scottish government in meltdown, coalition fallen apart, Humza Yousaf facing a confidence vote and so on. What do you... I mean, I hate asking people for predictions, but I'm going to do it anyway. What is likely to happen? Is he likely to cling on, or are we likely to have a new First Minister in Scotland shortly?
Great to see the psychodrama actually extends beyond the border as well. I mean, look, any politician that faces any kind of no confidence vote that looks like it's going to be widely supported. I mean, there are predictions. I think that he will survive potentially this no confidence vote next week, partly because there isn't really any great appetite from the Greens to want to collapse a nationalistic government, not knowing what would be erected in its place effectively. And so I think that although we may see that he's still in position by the end of next week, as with Westminster politics, I think as soon as there's a confidence vote, all the authority drains out, and it's very likely that he will not be the First Minister within 6 months from now, and that would be my prediction as to what happens in this case.
Well, so, I mean, Holyrood doesn't have an election until, I think, 2026, but of course there's a general election before that, and the position of the SNP is very important. And the SNP has generally undergone something of a meltdown since the last Westminster election. It's currently far and away the hugest party in Scotland, and it may not be for that much longer. Presumably there's rich pickings for Labour with the collapse of the SNP, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The ramification for what's happening in Scotland, really, in terms of our world that we exist in, is really what it would mean for the majority for Sir Keir Starmer at the time of an election. Of course, let's not forget that Labour has not done very well in Westminster elections in Scotland for some time now.
Sure.
Despite the fact that, basically elections, used to be won in Scotland effectively, and that they would have almost all the seats in Scotland, and that would prop up their sort of base in England. That hasn't been the case for some time now. And of course, they need to win big in Scotland. I think the last time I was talking to sort of Labour officials, they really pointed to the fact that they needed more than 20 seats to be within any kind of touching distance of a reasonable working majority in Westminster. So anything which obviously destabilises or makes the SNP less popular is very good news for Keir Starmer. And of course, no one likes instability. Nobody likes looking at these kind of psychodramas that are going on. This is the similar story that we've seen with the Conservative Party of late, and that has seriously damaged their polling. And of course, you would expect in this case this would do the same. So I think the big takeaway from this for me is what the impact will be on the sort of majority of the Labour Party overall.
Well, look, I feel I ask you this question every week, but let's talk about the next Westminster election. We must get behind Rishi Sunak is the message to rebellious Conservative MPs from Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, speaking to the Times today. And there is a rumour apparently floating around that the general election could be called on Monday. What have you heard? Where did it come from? Please tell me it's not true.
I've heard exactly the same as you. The rumours have been abounding all week that there could have been an election called on Thursday, Friday, or Monday next week, and that this is all about heading off any kind of attempts to topple the Prime Minister following the local election results and effectively rendering those local elections almost meaningless for the party. I'm sort of slightly counterintuitive about this. Everybody is pouring huge amounts of cold water on this, but they always do. And I broke the story, I'm thinking now, well, it's like 7-8 years ago, that Theresa May was going to call a snap general election. And all sorts of buckets were thrown all over me multiple times by everybody from the most senior parts of the Conservative Party saying, this was madness, she wasn't going to do it, absolutely not, there was not going to be an election. And then 10 days later, they called an election. So, I mean, looking at it from a rational perspective, and to be honest, I mean, you could ask me the same question every time we meet, and I would probably tell you the same thing.
Do you know, I think I do, but yeah.
The only person that genuinely knows is about 3 people, including the Prime Minister, about what they are really thinking about. Do I think that there's been more discussion about the prospects of there being an early election? Yes. Do I think that more people are coming over to the idea that an earlier general election might be in scope? Yes. Do I think it will happen? Not really. And the reasons for that are, I mean, I think there are good, sound reasons why you might call an election if you thought that you were going to face a confidence vote, to kind of protect your own integrity, to, stop it from being a kind of humiliation. But at the same time, we don't know what's going to happen with the local elections. There's certainly enough local mayoral elections in play for the Conservatives, including Ben Houchen's seat and also the East Midlands. That means that they might just scrape a couple of results which will enable them to point to sort of some improvements. But equally, I just think the idea that a Prime Minister would call an election 20 points behind in the polls when he doesn't have to. And when he could have another 6 months in Downing Street, which will arguably be the last time that he ever has that great privilege to occupy that high position of state. I just think human nature would tell me you wouldn't do that.
It's not something people do. No, I understand that. Indeed. Look, Grant Shapps, he also today spoke about defence spending, and of course Rishi Sunak announced a lot more defence spending last week. One thing being sort of thrown around is the question of whether the UK should invest in its own Iron Dome system, like the one used in Israel to repel missile strikes. What do you hear about that? And also, I guess I'm as interested, what are the politics here? Do the Tories feel it's very good for them to talk about defence?
Absolutely. They feel that they've had a good week this week. They've seen the legislation pass on Rwanda, and they've announced this uplift to defence spending to 2.5%, which actually has been received very well, which I'm slightly surprised about, given the fact that actually if you look at defence spending and the trajectories and what we really need to start spending on defence, given the current state of affairs and the threats that we face on multiple fronts, independent analysis would point to the fact that it should be more like 4% of GDP, not 2.5. And of course, people like Grant Shapps have been arguing that that figure should go northwards and that actually we should be looking towards a 3% uplift, not a 2.5% uplift. But generally speaking, the announcement has been received well. It seems that they're on the front foot on defence, partly because Labour have not agreed to match that pledge, which quite a few people within the party are wanting to make a bit of a song and dance about. So yes, they do feel very comfortable talking about this as a particular issue. Again, partly because Labour has, allowed there to be so many own goals in the past on this, such as front bench ministers not backing the nuclear deterrent or not backing NATO, and all of the other things that sort of happened under the Corbyn administration. So yes, on the Iron Dome issue in particular, I mean, I think if you asked people within the party and within the sort of Ministry of Defence, sort of intelligentsia, I'm not sure that they would say that that was particularly money well spent, given the state of the threats that we face currently, and also, the sort of issues that we're facing. We're not likely to face a war on our shores, particularly because we're an island as well. But we're much more likely to get involved
unless
in
Scotland
conflict.
really falls apart.
Well, unless it indeed. But it's much more likely that we'll get embroiled in a conflict as we are at present. On other, in other parts of the world, such as in the Middle East or such as in the Baltics.
An immediate local missile defence isn't really the point in that sort of conflict.
But it's great to talk tough about it, and I think that's why we're hearing so much about it, because it does look like a kind of bauble on the Christmas tree that we can all point to and say, one day we'll have this.
Rwanda.
Yes.
Would you say that we are now in a situation where we will, sooner or later, definitely be sending migrants to Rwanda or not?
It's a really good question again. I mean, look, they were in no hurry to get this legislation through, partly because I think there were so many logistical issues of getting this off the ground. I think at the end of the day, if we don't have an election, and that may be one reason why we might have an election, so that the government doesn't actually have to get to the point where it admits that it's not logistically possible, I think in the scenario that that doesn't happen, we will see at least a flight take off fairly shortly. Who those migrants will be on it, whether they are people that have been detained under this legislation or under previous legislation, or indeed whether they're part of an entirely different scheme where volunteers are paid to take a sort of deportation to Rwanda, remains to be seen. It's interesting that my sources were saying last week that they thought that a flight would go within the first 6 to 8 weeks, and yet the government seems to have elongated that to sort of 12 weeks, which again, I wonder what's going on behind the scenes that means that it's going to take them so long to do that. If, as we've been told all along, there weren't any problems, there was an airline, and this was all going to happen, seamlessly, which it doesn't seem to have done in the 2 years since we've been talking about this.
2 years. Wow. Look, finally, I think it's the Telegraph reports today that Labour is trying to make contact with Donald Trump's team ahead of potential election victories on both those sides. David Lammy's apparently met with several senior Trump figures. Is this a surprise? Is this what opposition parties always do? Is this a little dangerous? What do you think?
It is what opposition parties always do. And when I went out to Beirut with David Lammy at the beginning of the year and asked him some questions about what would happen with the Labour administration and Trump, particularly because he himself has said some fairly unsavoury things about the former president, he was very clear to me that diplomacy and the special relationship that we have with the United States exists and is important irrespective of who occupies that office of state. And I think that this is just a way in which he is showing that they want to have a relationship and that they need to have a relationship because that special relationship is so important to both sides. And I'm not surprised David Lammy's doing it. I mean, he is a kind of a real fan of America. He has good relationships, as we know, with Barack Obama. They had lunch or dinner, I forget, only a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's sensible that Labour would be wanting to reach out to one of the presidential candidates, or in fact both of the presidential candidates, given that there is a very good possibility that they will both be occupying office by the end of the year.
But given the general sort of toxicity of many people around Donald Trump, presumably there's an element of risk there as well.
There's always an element of risk. And, we know that that Trump is a fan of some people in political life here already, such as Nigel Farage, and is likely to make unhelpful interventions, as indeed he has done, throughout his kind of tenure. So, of course, there's risk, but I think that they probably think that it's a gamble that they should be taking, given that there are going to be some very serious issues looming on the horizon as soon as he becomes president, if indeed that happens, and as soon as they enter Downing Street, if indeed that happens.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Caroline Wheeler. And you can read more from Caroline, of course, in the Sunday Times tomorrow and all other Sundays.